Lots of people getting in touch and talking about these new reforms to workers' rights, employment rights. Many people have been suggesting things like the zero-hour contract, that Labour, with an outright ban of that, is the wrong thing to do because it removes the personal choice. There's lots of other things on here about flexible benefits to employees, potentially right from day one, increased unionisation powers and so on and so forth. I've got to say the Federation of Small Businesses, they've said that small businesses were, I quote, increasingly worried about the proposals driving up costs and risks of giving people jobs. You're a businessman, Ben Habib. Where are you on these?
Well, I completely endorse it. One of the complaints...
You endorse what?
Those views, that actually what you... Paradoxically, when you seek to protect a particular class of people, in this case workers, and there's another example of this in the King's Speech when it comes to people who want to rent property, but when you put in regulations to protect that class of people, paradoxically what you do is create additional costs of entry, costs of operation. And when you create those extra costs, you tend to deter people, in this case employers, from actually employing people. And when you deter employers from employing people, you obviously create problems within the employment market, the labour market. We've already got a broken labour market with up to around 6 million people claiming universal credit. And by making it more expensive, more difficult for employers to employ people, paradoxically, you're going to get less employment. And one of my complaints about the Brexit deal that Boris Johnson did, I've got many complaints about it, but one of the complaints was that he hitched us at the hip to EU regulations on employment law. So there's a kind of minimum floor below which we can't deregulate. And actually, if we want to get the United Kingdom's economy moving forward, if we want lower taxes, the taxes which Aaron said he was expecting, the tax rises he was expecting to see in here, if we want lower taxes, if we want to avoid higher taxes, what we've got to do is deregulate so that businesses can operate with less friction, less difficulty, and then you have a prosperous economy. And when you have a prosperous economy, wages go up, businesses prosper, and they employ more people. And so this move towards greater regulation actually, in many cases, and I would argue over the last 27 years, has been used relentlessly as a tool that has damaged, UK PLC and just about every business in the United Kingdom. Neil,
one of my viewers on the website, he says these new Labour laws will strangle business and enterprise and thus growth. Most growth, he says, in the economy does come from the small and the medium-sized businesses, not from the large, giant corporates. These SMEs, they can't bear any more costly regulatory burden. Aaron Bastani, where are you on some of these?
Well, the biggest cost for business, which has gone up substantially in the last several years, is, of course, energy. And then on top of that, you're going to have increased costs of credit because of interest rates. So the idea that this is somehow, the major cost that's been imposed on business over the last 5 years is inaccurate. What I would say is Britain is very good at creating jobs. It has had very low unemployment for a very long time. We have a major problem, which is more people are in poverty who work than who don't work. We have lots of in-work poverty. We all view that as bad, right? Let's start where we agree.
I disagree with a number of things you've already said, but I'm holding my tongue.
But we agree that in-work poverty is bad.
Yeah, but I disagree that we have low unemployment. We have very high unemployment. It's just that unemployment figures, official unemployment figures, only look at those people who are actively seeking to find a job, which is around 1.5 million. We've got 4.5 million people who aren't even looking for a job.
By the standards... OK, then let's look at employment, not unemployment, employment rates. By the standards of the European Union, Britain is pretty good at creating, because of the Thatcherite reforms of the 80s and the 90s, is pretty good at creating new jobs. And generally speaking, you can find a job quite easily. That has some upsides, that has some downsides, but that's just a feature of our economy. The big problem is, at the same time, we have lots of people who are in work who are also poor. If you look at, for instance, child poverty, the majority of kids in poverty have a parent in their household who works. Now, the question is, and again, we'll agree on that's a problem, we should try and resolve it as a country, how do you fix that? Labour's proposal is to change some features of the labour market in terms of changing rights from day one when you enter work. Now, you as a businessman know this. Somebody, when they start their contract, you know this as well, they'll start their contract at work. They're on probation anyway for the first 3 or 6 months.
Yeah,
and that's not changing, Ben. So if somebody starts playing silly buggers, the employer can still get rid of them. The idea that this is a really radical change, and from day one you're lumbered with this awful employee, you can't get rid of them, that simply isn't true.
But you've got to look at the direction of travel. When I started in work, it was 2 years probationary period before you had to have a reason to fire someone. Now it's 12 months. So, but let me tell you, you don't know the character of an individual until you've worked with them for some time. And problems arise and suddenly you're hamstrung. So you're very nervous of employing. We now have to statutorily provide pensions for employees, which we didn't have to do. And the way I addressed that when that statutory thing came in was to tell employees, I'm sorry, you're not getting a salary rise because we're having to do pension contributions instead. So that you strip away the opportunity for employees to choose how they spend their money. You actually, what you do is you make it a much more rigid, less manoeuvrable, less freewheeling economy. You look at the US, where they have many fewer employment laws than we do, and the economy has grown immeasurably compared to ours. Ours has been stagnant for 20 years, roughly, our economy. The US is growing year in, year out, partly to do with their energy policy as well, partly to do with some other things. But they have a very freewheeling approach to employment, and they have very high levels of employment. And we desperately need to break away from that European model, that socialist model of in the pursuit of the protection of the employee, we kill the employer. It's bad for business.
I just fundamentally disagree. I mean, Ben's a perfectly affable man, but I just fundamentally disagree. I don't think Britain's major issue is that we have too strong protections for employees. You're absolutely right. You might employ a wrong one, and this is something the left has to grasp. Businesses shouldn't be punished for making a bad hiring decision, because ultimately that doesn't help anybody. You want a productive business, you want happy employees. I appreciate all of that. I would simply say what's being proposed here is it's not that big a shift.
I am very nervous of employing people because of the difficulty of getting rid of them.
But that's already on the statute book.
Yeah, and this is going to make it worse.
Well, not really.
Yeah, zero-hours contracts allows some businesses. I'm not a great fan of zero-hours contracts, by the way. But zero-hours contracts does afford those hospitality businesses that have very large peaks and troughs to be able to oscillate in and out of the employment market without any cost. Otherwise, you've got to take a full-time employee on, keep them working 365 days of the year through all the seasons, even when you may not have any custom. And that's bad for business.
Can you just give them a temporary 3-month contract? I mean, that's, well, there's a via media, there's a middle way here, isn't there?
Well,
you give them a
all I'm
3-month,
saying
6-month contract.
What we want, what we desperately need, we've had 27 years of regulatory impositions on the United Kingdom. One of the great benefits of Brexit should have been that we could throw away those regulations that have held us back in this country from the EU, and we haven't done it. And this King's Speech takes us further and further towards that kind of over-regulated, nanny state interventionist, controlling, top-down form of economic management, which is so damaging to the Anglo-Saxon way. We've got to get back, as that brilliant texter said. We're a country of 96% of businesses in this country are small and medium-sized enterprises. We need them on their front foot. Lots of regulation suits big corporations because they can navigate the regulations. SMEs can't.
I agree with that entirely.
They haven't got the wherewithal.
I agree with that entirely. What I would say as well, just quickly on Liz Truss, she was highlighting all these awful things: smoking ban, Tory policy; housing targets, Tory policy.
Well, Gove got rid of them, didn't he?
Well, I know, but there was a housing, it was meant to be 300, then it was 200, well, I can't remember, it's always changing. And then, she's saying that giving more powers to the OBR. I agree, by the way, that's bad news. The Tories created the OBR. George Osborne created the OBR in 2010. So,
well, George Osborne was part of the Blair regime, wasn't he?
We can bash the Labour Party in their King's Speech, but look, Liz Truss is criticising the Conservative Party of 2010, of 2019 actually, in some of this, just as much as she's criticising the Labour Party.
And what about, so there'll be things that you do like, sir, the whole principle of fire and rehire. Labour have pledged to do away with that. Do you like that?
Well, ironically, Labour have actually used fire and rehire to get rid of their own staff in the past, but there you are. I think there are...
Well, tell people about that might not be familiar with that.
So Labour got rid of a bunch of employees after Keir Starmer came in. His preferred General Secretary, David Evans, came in. And, of course, like any organisation, you have a change of management. They want to do things their own way. They got rid of a bunch of staff and then they rehired a bunch of staff. And they effectively got rid of staff on the weakest contractual conditions. Many of those actually weren't particularly robust contracts at all. They weren't congruent with quote-unquote Labour values. So you see lots of, let's say, contradictions here rather than double standards.
But I mean, it's a really good example of that. So this is what they're banning is the businesses firing someone on certain terms and conditions, then immediately offering them a job on a lower salary or whatever. Yeah. That's being banned. So what that means is they're going to fire those people and they won't rehire them because they're going to have to fire them anyway.
I think, you know what? There'll just be more quote-unquote restructures. There are always, like you said about the major businesses, there will always be ways around this stuff. And I agree with you, by the way. Small businesses are less able to navigate that.
And when you have to find a workaround, there's a cost associated with it. You've got to get an accountant's advice or a liquidator's advice, or you've got to do an insolvency or whatever it is. And all of that is a burden on business. And we've got to take the burden off business. The private sector is on its back foot. We had COVID lockdowns on and off for 3 years, which has decimated our private sector, our hospitality sector. It needs a leg up.
I would say to that quickly, the biggest problem for business, other than rampant energy bills and very expensive...
Which is also a consequence of lockdowns.
Access to credit, yeah, we agree. Yeah. Expensive energy is definitely a bad thing. But a major problem, especially for something like hospitality, is there is not enough money in the consumer's back pocket. Now, Labour, again, would say that's precisely why we want to create better working conditions, because my father's a taxi driver. For instance, if more people have more money in their back pocket, it means they can take a taxi once in a while. They can go out for dinner, they can go to a hotel.
Why didn't they reduce tax on the working class? Why didn't they cut?
It's already quite low, to be fair.
No, it's not. The threshold at which tax is paid, 12,500, has been held there for the last 3 years. It's due to be held there until 2028 unless Labour change it. And that has caught millions and millions of people in the tax net. And one of the reasons we've got 6 million people, this is where, I disagree that there aren't many people unemployed. There are many, many millions of people unemployed in this country, is because actually it doesn't pay to work. And part of the problem here, which we haven't discussed, is immigration, the very low-skilled, cheap imported labour, which has undermined wage growth. So there's a multiplicity of issues, but you don't solve it through over-regulating.
Well, let's come on to that